Joining us now to talk more about these developments involving the former president is attorney and former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani. Neama, let's start with the latest headlines coming out of Colorado. The state Republican Party there has now petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn the state Supreme Court's ruling, keeping Donald Trump off the 2024 ballot. Do you think the court will take this up? After all, we now have two state Supreme Courts out with differing opinions on this issue, Michigan and Colorado.
Del, I do. And this is exactly what the U.S. Supreme Court is meant to do. Take on cases of constitutional significance involving novel legal issues when there's a clear split. So you have two different Supreme Courts analyzing both the 14th Amendment and state law, reaching two very different results. And of course, these aren't the two only courts to consider the issue. There are other courts that have ruled that president must be impeached before the 14th Amendment applies. Others have said that the plaintiffs don't have standing. So really the question for the Supreme Court justices to answer is, we all know what the 14th Amendment says, but who enforces it and how is it enforced? Or is it self-executing? That's the decision that the Supreme Court will likely take on.
Neama, we now have a number of requests involving Donald Trump and his legal battles pending before the Supreme Court. How do you think they'll handle all of this? And can they take them all on before Election Day?
That's going to be the issue, because we know that unless oral argument is heard more or less by April, it's unlikely that the court is going to reach a decision within this current term. And that would push everything past the November 2024 general election. Of course, the Supreme Court just recently decided not to fast track the appeal in the presidential or executive immunity case. And the stay in the DC election fraud case may put that case past the election as well. Of course, we know that Trump's team is going to want this case before the Supreme Court this term to lift that restriction there in Colorado, because that stay or pause is only in effect until early January.
Neama, we know what the former president wants. We know what special counsel Jack Smith wants. But what about the taxpayers? Do they have a right to basically expect a decision in this case before Election Day? Because after all, we could be electing a convicted felon.
We could, and obviously we know that Trump's best defense in all of these cases is delay, because if he is reelected and he regains control of the White House, it's pretty well established that a sitting president can't be prosecuted. That's why every step in every case, he's trying to push this out. And the irony is Jack Smith, even though he won on executive immunity in the trial court there in D.C., he's trying to fast track the appeal to get around these stays. And of course, Republicans are saying, well, really, it's your fault, Special Counsel Smith. You waited more than 2 years to bring these charges. So you need to give us, the defense, enough time to prepare our case. But we know this is a procedural tactic more than a substantive defense.
Is there a decision that the Supreme Court can make in this case, and it harkens back to Bush v. Gore, that will not be deemed political by either side?
I don't think so, Del. We're talking about the most politically charged prosecutions in American history, and 3 of the 9 Supreme Court justices were nominated by Donald Trump himself. So whatever decision the high court makes, I think will receive political blowback. And we know that Chief Justice John Roberts has tried to avoid this entirely. But I think it's going to be impossible for the Supreme Court to stay out of the political fray here.
So should the Supreme Court decide on the Colorado case, we know now that Michigan Supreme Court has opted to allow Trump to remain on the ballot. Will that be the deciding factor for all of these cases standing before state Supreme Courts? Or could we see this issue come up again, even if the court decides the Colorado case and you have another court, say, for instance, Michigan, saying, OK, we've decided that he can't appear on the general ballot?
Dale, I think the Colorado case is the most important, and this is why. Colorado imposes the most stringent requirements on both candidates. They have to attest that they're constitutionally eligible, as well as the Secretary of State in Colorado to determine who is eligible and who is not. Most states don't have these types of stringent election laws. So to the extent that the U.S. Supreme Court gets involved, and if they reverse the Colorado decision, I think that would apply to most other states in the country.
So let's talk about the special counsel Jack Smith in his filing today to have a judge bar Trump from making political attacks, in his words, in the election interference case. The argument there is that a jury could be swayed. And it's safe to say we already see some of the things that Trump is saying about the special counsel showing up in interviews that are being conducted on the campaign trail.
Del, I agree. I mean, the question, though, is a judge willing to impose that kind of gag order, that prior restraint on speech? And more importantly, are they willing to enforce such an order? Because everything we've seen so far with respect to gag orders, Trump has violated them at every step of the way. And to the extent that he's been sanctioned, we're talking about small fines, $5,000 and $10,000 in the New York civil fraud case. But no one has taken the unprecedented step of holding him in contempt or even revoking his bail or conditions of release. So unless the judge is willing to actually enforce these orders, they're worth not much more than the electronic paper they're written on.
Neama, I got 30 seconds left, but there are thousands of people in this country who want to call their prosecutors names, from the drug dealer to the person who has actually been busted for speeding. Should they be able to say that they think their prosecutors should rot in hell?
Generally, you can, but again, this is not a case that is typical. Normally, most criminal defendants, they don't want to attack the person that's prosecuting them, much less the judge that's overseeing their case. But of course, Donald Trump is no typical criminal defendant.
Attorney and former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani. Neama, as always, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.